diverse voices in the energy revolution. Here's your host, Amy Simpkins.
Welcome back for another episode of the Power Flow podcast. I'm your host, Amy Simpkins, and today my guest is Representative Liana Cassar of the Rhode Island House of Representatives. She's in her second term in the Rhode Island House. Her legislative priorities are good government, economic justice, reproductive justice, and environmental stewardship. She currently serves on the House committees on Health and Human Services and Small Business. Representative Cassar has spent the past 20 plus years working across the healthcare and public health sectors in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. With a background in public health operations and systems, she currently consults with mission-driven and women-led businesses, mainly in the care economy, on operations planning, change management, and systems development. She holds a master's in public health from Boston University and a master's in business administration from Simmons College. Liana, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Amy. This is really fun, and I'm so glad you've started the podcast.
Oh, it's so fun, and I'm so glad to be talking to you today. And I know that your background is a little bit different from some of our other guests who have been in energy, for a long time. They take the technical side of energy, and you come out of the public health sector, but you pay a ton of attention to energy issues because of your position as a legislator. And as a legislator, you have to take a look at all sorts of issues that impact your community and the people you serve. So tell me a little bit more about that. Tell me about the transition from public health and, how you see energy issues brought to the table.
Absolutely. It's been an interesting transition going from outside of the building to inside of the building. When you work in healthcare and a number of other sectors, you have these sort of annual check-ins where the new legislation, the new regulations that come down the pike as a result of federal and state legislation and policy making sort of impact you. So you sort of roll with the punches. You understand the cycle. And going from the public health field, being out, from working on healthcare software to operations within various organizations and clinical settings, to coming inside the building, there really isn't as much expertise inside the building. Obviously, it's a democratically elected group of folks who stand up to run, right? We didn't decide that 5% are from the health sector and 5% are from the energy sector and 5% from manufacturing. We really have a random sample of people with a random sample of expertise. There is probably in every legislature an oversampling of lawyers. There's a bit of an oversampling of people who come from higher socioeconomic levels. There's an oversampling of people who are white. There are oversamplings of certain parts of the population, but there is not an oversampling of people who understand systems and health systems and energy systems and agriculture. So we really depend on people outside of the building, and some of the what are referred to as special interests, sometimes referred to as lobbyists, sometimes referred to as advocates. A lot of folks sort of live in a gray area among those categories. We really depend on those folks and the experts to give us the information that will help inform good policymaking. And as you can imagine, not everybody knows exactly when to show up. So it's a very interesting world of trying to get the right information to inform legislation at the right times. Of course, there's legislation that's being pushed, driven by a particular group. And so you end up getting that flood of information when you are in the chamber from those groups. But every session is different. So now I've been through 3 legislative sessions. In Rhode Island, we are in session from January through June. And all of our bills get introduced in sort of the first couple months of the legislative calendar. And then we have hearings and budget that go through for the rest until we get to the end of June, when a whole heck of a lot of stuff happens. And depending on what's popular or what is really driving the agenda for that year, we focus on it. So this year in particular was interesting because we were coming off of 2020 when everything had been disrupted. We did barely any work in 2020. So it felt like we had double the amount of legislation in 2021. Just before I was elected, actually my election year, 2018, was when I really started to think about energy policy, because in Rhode Island, there was a power plant being proposed in a rural area in northern Rhode Island. And it was fascinating because it seemed like it was just going to be, more fossil fuel infrastructure. We needed a replacement. There's our fossil fuel infrastructure in the Northeast is aging. There are certain spots where we could use a little upgrade. And the power plant proposal was actually defeated through citizen advocacy. And what I was trying to understand as I was knocking on doors and canvassing and hearing questions from constituents about it, even though it's not close to my district, I mean, it's Rhode Island. We're about, very small comparatively. And so it is from a Colorado way, it's close to my district, but, it's not right next door. But what happened was, I really wanted to understand, how do we maintain our current infrastructure until we have a clean energy infrastructure? We're not ready to go free of fossil fuels right now. This is what everything relies on. So how do we make that transition? And I needed enough information to be able to, when I was knocking on doors and talking to constituents, to be able to say, I understand our state's energy infrastructure enough to know that I'm going to oppose that if this were to come for a vote before me, I would oppose that. So it was really interesting. It was a little bit of a crash course in power plants, in rural development, in rural zoning. But I think that's very often how legislators learn. You get this big item that sort of comes down the pike and you have no way around it. You have to learn. And so that's unfortunately how most of us get briefed on energy policy, is a little bit of a trial by fire. But we do have great agencies, and I think every state probably does. We have our Office of Energy Resources and the utilities, the Public Utilities Council. So there are some resources, but usually you're tapping into them as soon as you need information on a particular piece of legislation or a budget item.
Yeah, totally. I think, from the broader perspective of someone who's in the industry, that transition piece from the how do we make the transition from fossil fuel-based generation or majority fossil fuel-based generation over to clean energy, and how do we do that in a way that is reliable and that still supports communities with energy. And I think that's what's so fascinating to me right now about the energy industry, is that it has these multiple layers. Like, it's just not about sustainability, clean energy, reversing climate change. Like, that's only one layer of a huge, layer cake of issues that, energy really supports people. From the public health perspective, I have been known to say it's no longer a luxury; it's a human right, because when energy goes away, people die. Medical equipment, sufficient heat, the ability to cook and have clean water, all has foundations with energy, and then connected to that piece is community resilience in case of natural disaster, like when the grid goes down, how long does it take to come back? What are the other options for reliability? That's some more reliability. And then the energy equity issue. How do we make sure that everyone has equal access to energy? And all of these stack up, and one facet isn't necessarily more important than the other. Yeah, yes, we have to save the planet, absolutely. But you are exactly right. I'm seeing that all over the country, is how do we gracefully make the transition? We can't just shut the entire grid down for a few months while we rebuild it. and then bring it back up. You can't do it.
Absolutely. What you're saying makes me think of two things. In order to translate policy for constituents, I often use analogies. And the thing I see is when you need to build a new house, when your house is just to a point where you can't fix it anymore and you need a new space, you can't just say, okay, so move out so we can tear it down. And for those 8 weeks, good luck out there. Use a tent in the backyard, would you? We can't do that with this particular infrastructure. And so and the reason why it's important to really talk about that is we have a loud advocacy community, which is wonderful and vibrant and all kinds of Green New Deal. And they want to shut it down and start the new. And there's that space in between shutting down the old and turning on the new. And it's really a rich and important space. And we need to get it right. And so you're impatient, right? I'm definitely impatient for that time when we all have, clean running cars, and I want my little microgrid here in my neighborhood. I have all sorts of ideas of how to make it happen. But right now, we all use gas. So how do we switch? How do we move the infrastructure? Because it might need to take up the same space, right? We may not want to host two different energy systems at a time while we get one online and one offline. We need to think about that. It's going to require the creative thinking. But very often what we just want to innovate about is that future piece and not that interim step.
Oh, totally. So when a new piece of a new energy issue comes across your desk, whether that's this power plant or if it's a piece of legislation about regulations, what do you do? Who do you call? Who do you tap?
Mm-hmm. Well, one piece of legislation that was important for us this year, and I was really optimistic, and we weren't able to get it through, was proposed by one of my colleagues, Representative Terry Cortrand, and it's part of a larger effort. So it's the Transportation Climate Initiative, which is a regional collaboration. There are 13 or 14 states and Washington, D.C., and it really is about reducing carbon emissions, improving the clean energy economy, improving our transportation sector, energy use, and that is just this massive piece of legislation. Some of the pieces are really addressed through regulatory collaboration across the states already, but there's a need for some funding and a need for some legislation. And what I did was I spoke with the director of the Department of Environmental Management, who is the point person for the state collaborating with the other states. And because I felt like it would be inefficient for me to just get all my questions asked by calling him, because when you're a legislator, you can call the heads of agencies and they answer your questions, which seems so great. But there are 75 of us in our chamber, and I feel kind of like you can't possibly do this 75 times. So what I did was I hosted during COVID, I had a virtual coffee hour with constituents every Wednesday morning. And so I asked him to come. And so we had a constituent conversation about it. So I think very often, Rhode Island, I'd love to think we're a little easier than most, but I would venture that just about every state, if you work with your local legislator on an issue, they may be able to get that kind of constituent conversation for you. And I think it's important for not just me to know about things like the Transportation Climate Initiative and the details and how it really works. But I think it's critical for constituents to know just what does that look like? What does the implementation of transportation energy improvements look like in our community? Is that more buses? Is that a new public transportation model? There are things that they need solutions for, like local commuting, that they don't realize are plugged into other kind of larger policy issues. And we can get more support from folks if we let them know what we're working on. Do you feel like
well, let's see. How am I going to ask that? Do you feel like you have a good handle on that? Do you feel like you're that person, the person who can see across, the priorities? Because I love that perspective, by the way. And I definitely see how, like I said before, energy kind of touches a lot of different things. I want to say energy touches everything, but let's not be hyperbolic. But energy touches a lot of different things, and I always love to look at these like holistic solutions that, like, we're looking at not just energy, but also transportation and food, growing and equity and all of these other things. But like, from I can see that your perspective is even broader than that. And like, is that part of the role of an elected official, is to hold space for the holistic solutions that touch a lot of different areas?
I think it is. And I have the luck of coming into this seat from an operations point of view. So my background, what I've done in my actual day-to-day work has been managing the operations of a health clinic, managing the operations of projects, managing the operations of healthcare software integrations. So I look at the ways that things connect so that they can work within our systems. And I love systems thinking, and think we probably from about third grade should start learning systems thinking, because even in the simple questions, the math questions of like, Susie has 3 apples and she gives 1 to John. How many apples does she have left? Well, it depends if the apples were ripe, or how many apples can she eat today? Were they ripe? Are they clean? Were they tested? Do they have pesticides? Is she allergic? There's a lot of things. It's not, none of it's simple, right? But there's also the richness to the complexity of that. And so I think of it in 2 ways. I think of it from operations point of view, and I think of it from the convenient sort of social science concept of intersectionality. Every issue is intersectional. And I would say, I would support you in saying that energy touches everything, because, we just had Hurricane Henri come through New England and hit Rhode Island, and we had power outages, and that touches food, transportation, health, it did touch everything. The day that your power goes out for 48 hours, it's going to change everything about what you do that day, because we are so dependent on energy. You'll have different options of things to do, but it will shift. And I think we need to be mindful of that and understand sort of what that role is. So I definitely feel like more people in legislative office really could use to have more systems thinking sort of concepts as they move through policymaking. Very often we get policymakers who are like, I'm an environmental person, or I'm a health policy person, right? And they just run that ball down the field and they get that environmental bill passed. But the municipalities now have a financial burden because they have unfunded mandates, right? But if we thought about how all of that connected to some of the other issues, then we could probably make it a more sustainable policy, right? We could make it a more successful policy.
Yeah, I love how you've used the word richness a couple of times, because that's the trick of complexity, right? That like too much complexity and you get very overwhelmed, especially humans who really like to imagine that things are simple. But really, like you say, the richness of complexity is the opportunity. And, potentially the opportunity to solve multiple problems at once, because they are intersectional.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, we have an opportunity in energy policy and thinking about developing our clean energy sector. You mentioned energy equity earlier, and that's really a priority for me. But there are so many layers of that, right? We are looking at unemployment rates. We're looking at, racial inequality from the economic point of view. Well, when we look at the jobs that have been created in the clean energy sector or in the energy sector in general, we probably need to take a look at how can we also make sure there's equity in who is getting trained, who those jobs are available to. And sometimes the job might be great. The job might be a fabulous entry-level job, but there may not be transportation to that job. That's an equity issue. We need to think about all of the ways that we can keep infusing equity into every level of how we think about energy. In Rhode Island, one of the things that is just it's a visible problem with our energy sector, or in our energy sort of legacy. So Rhode Island is, if Rhode Island were a sheet of paper, a sheet of 8.5 by 11 paper, you would rip it up the middle and sort of open it up, and the bay runs right up that middle part, right?
Sure.
And so we have East Bay and West Bay. And those of us who live on the East Bay, when we drive along and have the view of the West Bay, what we see now, we also see 3 wind turbines, which is fabulous. But along the West Bay shoreline is just the detritus of poor zoning and overuse of, from all of the energy and shipping. It is a rough shoreline that has a lot of the remnants of poor planning, right? So the community that has developed over there and the neighborhoods that have developed over there have higher asthma rates. They have, sort of more pollution, a lot of issues. If we don't see that as a policy issue, as an environmental development issue, as an economic development issue, as an education issue, as a health issue, then we miss out on really sort of solving the problem and addressing some of that equity. Like, it's a visible inequity. My side of the bay, I represent a community that is more affluent. We don't have those same sort of impacts of the industrialization on our shore. But it really is, it's very clear how the inequity has played out.
Yeah. Wow. And so what's the, how does that again come kind of across your desk in terms of individual issues? I mean, and then there obviously a legislator can sponsor a bill, right? And so what, how does that work? How do we address that? And when I say we, I mean sort of collectively, like, obviously the policymaker has a role to play. And then, we've got a whole bunch of project implementers here, especially, we're specifically talking to, energy industry implementers here, but also citizen implementers in general. Like, how do we make change, I guess, is the question. That's a good transition point, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. So my bottom line on how do we make change is we engage. So right now, what we see, and over the past 18 months, I would say, we have seen more people get engaged, maybe even over the past 4 years, right? More people have gotten engaged on social issues and environmental issues. And so we're seeing more, more demonstrations and protests. We're seeing more communication, writing, blogs, fundraising, advocacy groups. So that's a great start. But when I look at the State House in Rhode Island, there are a lot of good people there, but there's a lot of old school representation at the top that decides what bills really move through, right? And there's a lot of corporate decision makers who have influence on what goes through. And almost none of those people live in the communities that are most negatively affected, right? So we need to elevate the voices of the people from those communities. We need to elect leaders. There's a little bit of a, I sometimes think there's the immediate impact we can have, and then there's the long-term pipeline impact we can have.
Yeah.
We have to elect people who understand the issues, have lived experience, and who truly will represent the communities impacted. And we need to continue to beat the drum for the people who don't yet get it, who don't yet see it as urgent to clean up our energy, to sort of decarbonize, to remove the industrialization from neighborhoods where it's having a negative impact. We need to make it louder. We need to make it economically reasonable. We need to come up with the solutions, not just say, I don't want this in my community, but what did this do for my community? This brought a tax-paying corporation into my community. So if we're not collecting property taxes, and if we're renters and I'm not paying property taxes, but that holding tank for fuel is paying property taxes, I need to figure out what is the trade-off, right? Because our municipal leaders are having to make those trade-offs too. We need innovative thinking to come in and help those advocates, not just advocate for no more fossil fuels or no more fill in the blank. We need people to come in and say, okay, but what's a creative way to solve this? How can we turn this around? If just public health facts could change policy, we would have passed more, gun safety regulations. We would have stopped vaping, we would have it. So if it were public health data that actually drove policy, COVID, we don't even have to get into COVID, but so that doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
We need to engage. We need a lot of people thinking about what are the right incentives to help legislators do the right thing. And I put that in air quotes, but it's what is going to be the right thing that's the best for the well-being of all.
Yeah. Well, I love all of this, and so much of what you're saying is absolutely consistent with what we heard on the Power Flow podcast in episode 4 with Camille Terry, who is Los Angeles based. And she talked about so many of these things, like from making sure that people are represented in the room, the people who are affected by decisions, the people who actually work in the area where the decision is, matters, to give feedback, to give input. She was talking about creating clean, green jobs, and making sure, because it's a health issue, not just to install clean energy that doesn't give you asthma, but also to make sure that workers are safe on site, that is also part of, and then she was also talking about one more thing that I just had in my head and I can't think of. Anyway, is very, very similar. And so, yeah, I'm throwing that out there for our show notes to episode 4 is a really complimentary discussion, from a person in industry, that you have a person in industry and then you have a policymaker, like all of these stories that we're telling converge on the same themes. And so to me, that's very encouraging. So we're going to take a really quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the view from the legislator's seat of challenges to the clean energy economy. And we're back, and we're talking today with Rhode Island State Representative Liana Cassar, and so glad to have you here. And so we're going to launch off. I have some more questions actually about what we were just talking about, which was, the increasing engagement, making sure education is good. But I want to back up one real quick and first talk about some of the challenges. And I want to be specific to energy right now. What do you see from your seat as the biggest challenge or roadblock standing between us and that clean energy economy of the future?
One of our biggest challenges is the narrative. It's the narrative that clean energy and a strong economy are incompatible. So when we were talking about the Transportation Climate Initiative here in Rhode Island, it's an amazing feat already without even any further legislation. We have 13 states and Washington, D.C. collaborating Okay, so I mean, just like I a huge round of applause.
That's a big deal.
That is a big freaking deal.
What?
And so you think about, the Northeast corridor. I'm from New England, and so when I travel to DC, I often take the train, and that is a beautiful swath of land. It is, a lot of preservation. It also includes Boston, New York, Philadelphia. It's also a very industrialized corridor, right? New Jersey. So that these entities have come together and said, we want to improve the transportation energy economy, we want to reduce carbon emissions from the transportation sector altogether. We really understand how the integration of improving our transportation, our public transportation, will help our energy sector. Fabulous, absolutely fabulous stuff. And it has taken years and a whole heck of a lot of collaboration. But what most Rhode Islanders know about it is that there is an opposition to an increased gas tax. Someone put out a rumor at some point that the gas tax would go up if we passed the TCI bill. So nobody wants an increase in their gas tax. Now, granted, and I believe Rhode Islanders are wonderful people. We all do our part. But I think if you ask 10 Rhode Islanders what the current gas tax is, they couldn't tell you.
I know.
Right? So the narrative is our biggest opponent sometimes. And that narrative comes from various lobbying interests. I couldn't tell you right now who the origin was of the gas tax myth, but the Transportation Climate Initiative will not raise taxes on gas. But if someone believes that currently, I can't convince them. I can't seem to effectively convince them otherwise. And that's not even the right conversation to be having. The right conversation to be having is what is the relationship between transportation in the Northeast Corridor and climate resilience and energy, and what are the clean energy opportunities? What are the economic opportunities? There's a whole lot of other conversation to be had. But very often this, like so many things, kind of like the gun safety legislation, kind of like reproductive rights legislation, there is a narrative that that supersedes the logic of the policy discussion. And we miss out on actually making progress when we let those narratives persist. At the same time, by the 10th time someone says, are you going to vote for that bill? Because it's going to raise our gas prices. By the 10th time, you're ready to just like put your hand up and walk away. But we need to have that conversation, and it needs to be not just me as a legislator. I need citizen emissaries who can say, you know what, when it comes up at a cocktail party, real or virtual, oh my gosh, that crazy TCI bill. You know what? Tell me what you know about it, and help debunk the myths, because so much mythology is getting in the way of good work.
So I'm gonna come with logic here, which when you're talking about narratives like this, logic clearly isn't in play usually. And so, I'm going to ask the question anyway, that like, I don't understand this argument about the clean energy, like weakening the economy somehow. Because, of all the issues, like if you talk about reproductive rights, okay, like there's no connection to the economy there, or if it is, it's a weird like backdoor way into the economy, but this is literally like, we're not talking about shutting down like fossil fuel, mining, refining, and generation, and like that leaves this giant pit of a hole in our economy. We're talking about taking one technology and gradually, in a very thoughtful way, replacing it with a new technology that will need to be manufactured and installed and maintained for many years by people who have jobs and pay taxes. And, you're talking about just a different energy currency when you're talking about kilowatt hours off of solar or wind as you're talking about kilowatt hours off of a diesel plant or a natural gas plant. And so like, to me, I'm like, this is an economy and this is an economy. We're just transitioning kind of between the currency that we use between the economies. This was actually the thing that I had forgotten that I was going to say before the break about Camille Terry's episode, was that she was saying that, we're creating jobs, we're creating economy. And I think that is part of the narrative, that like the narrative is that there's all this loss without seeing that there's gain. And I mean, I'm not talking about saving the planet and reversing climate change. I'm talking about cold hard, like dollars and cents and numbers of jobs and people employed and trained to do things. Like, I don't understand the narrative that there's some negative effect to our economy with clean energy. Do you have any idea?
So I'm not going to have a satisfying answer for this. Okay. I'm going to tell you that right off the bat. So, but I do want to point out that for a good long time, the fossil fuel industry, the automotive industry, the chemical industry, the petroleum and plastics industries have worked very hard to have a narrative in state houses across the country and in Washington that any change to their business model is going to be bad for the economy. So that is embedded in the fabric of many of our chambers of commerce, who are strong lobbyists in all of our state houses, many of our business organizations. So it's not so much that there's a specific one-on-one conversation that we can just unweave. This is really a larger mindset that has become part of the legislative landscape. And so if you have a trucking company, you have a business model that is based on fossil fuels and fossil fuel consumption. Your interest in 2022, changing that to any other fuel model is very small. It looks like a major strategic overhaul, right? And that's not what you're in the business of doing. You're in the business of hauling product from one place to another without major change. So I also wouldn't underestimate just how hard it is for humans to change systems that they have come to rely on.
Truth.
Right?
Absolutely.
Some of it is actually very simply that. I can't imagine, when I think of clean energy, I think of, but like when one thinks of clean energy, it is generally solar, wind, hydrogen batteries. So how do I do that? How do I change everything to that? I can't just go to the gas station. I can't just am I going to have to retrofit my HVAC system? We need to help people understand, what does this look like? We need to make it a positive change. Right now, going from fossil fuels to clean energy, I think people would rather go to the dentist, right? They just can't picture it being a painless process.
Right. It's fear. It's right. Fear. And it's about getting beyond the fear, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally hear you. And I think we're seeing, what I particularly work on in my day job is providing economic justification for for distributed energy systems. And so being able to come in and say, maybe not to the trucking company, just because, long haul electric vehicles are starting to be a thing, but they're not going to be a thing for a few years. So, but say it was a large industrial manufacturer, which we've worked with some large industrial manufacturers with a plant. And, they're like, well, the production line has to stay up. My business model is based on uptime. And sure, and then quality control, which is also about a regular, reliable. And I don't want to have to think about, how my energy comes or doesn't come. And so part of, what we do is to speak to the bottom line and say, like, no, like, actually, if you're going over to these distributed energy resources, and, oh, by the way, the generation is coming from renewables, we're actually going to save you money, and it is going to feel worth it. And so, definitely, I think part of it is trying to speak a language of industry, trying to speak a language that overcomes that fear of change. What is ultimately going to motivate that change that everyone's afraid of? And there has to be some carrot, some promise of something better other than the nebulous, well, it'd be nice to save the planet, right?
Right. Like, and I think you're right. It has to become a competitive advantage, because right now, if you are in the executive suite in August 2021, right now you are thinking about what is going to give your organization a competitive advantage in 2022. And there are a lot of options.
Yeah.
Energy use is only one.
Absolutely.
And is it the place? Is that really the place where you want to spend the energy? What is going to be the right incentive so that we can get organizations to think that way? It's a nice to have, yes, but it's not necessarily proving as a priority for competitive advantage in most organizations right now. And that's so until we have policy, until we have regulatory requirements that make it so, we're gonna be doing this dance. And some states are gonna do better than others, and we do have some states have some fabulous energy policy, or they're moving in the direction of fabulous energy policy, but we're still we need to think about how the entities work that have the highest energy consumption, so that we can start to tip the scales a bit and create the efficiencies in the grid in order to be able to sort of have those proof points for the smaller organizations. Because, like the pizzeria or the car dealership, really, that is not where they're going to spend it unless they can find some really good savings, right? Unless they can really find a way to make it efficient or make it a brand value. That's just not going to be the priority, especially coming out of the pandemic, until there is some external force that makes it so, right? Until the environment can't stand it anymore, or until your fuel prices are too high, or until your fuel infrastructure starts to degrade and you may as well switch to something else, right? Until there's an external force, their business models are not necessarily ready for them to take that. And we need more leadership to be brave, to be courageous, and embrace what we all know, which is we're moving to a clean energy future. It's just how fast we're going to move and who's going to go first.
And what we're seeing, a lot of those things you just mentioned of like, the impetus for change are, sticks in a world of carrots and sticks.
Totally.
There are penalties of like, the cost of energy too high, the infrastructure crumbling, and power not available, which we are seeing happen in certain areas that want to do electrification. And then they go to plug something into the wall and their power company's like, sorry, I wasn't ready for that level of demand, and you can't have it, But the other side, the carrot side, actually it's a big policy issue. And, incentives, like state level incentives, are a really big deal. And in a lot of places, state level incentives are making the difference between a project that doesn't pencil and a project that does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a lot of opportunity, and there are already existing a number of ways where we just should be doing better, right? One conversation I just had recently was in regards to a affordable housing situation where, the climate has changed. So units that were built 20, 25 years ago didn't need to have air conditioning, right? Units that are built today have central air, right? However, what has happened is the units that were built 25 years ago can't sustain 25 single air conditioning units. So they are constantly having power outages, right? They are having their own issues. And what do you do? How do you retrofit that? And where is the funding? So you have buildings that are in slight decline, more asthma risk. Now you have them unable to be ventilated appropriately, COVID risk, right? And an unstable power supply. So we need to be thinking very proactively about how do we retrofit what we have? And how do we make sure? And so if the climate wasn't changing so fast, we wouldn't have had 6 weeks of really hot, sweaty weather in a place where 25 years ago, we maybe had 1 week or 7 days spread out over the whole summer. Like, we have to adapt also. We've got this intersection of energy and climate issues that we really need to address. And again, the people who are most burdened are the people with the least resources to be handling it.
So one more kind of question before we close. I did want to go back because you were talking about the most important things we can do to be solving, the challenges, the gaps between what policy gets made versus not, is that narrative, and is the engagement with the community where these narratives carry through. And my question is, so in order to shift those narratives, what do you think opponents or carriers of the narrative need to see to shift that? Because from my chair, I am one of the many hats that I wear is a data scientist. And I'm like, well, they just need more data.
I wish it was just data.
And
I wish that was the solution.
I mean, you just said it, and it kind of like, punched me in the face when you were like, well, you've seen COVID. I mean, like, what about that data is in question,
Yeah,
and
there's no ambiguity there.
And it doesn't
no
matter.
Ambiguity. Right.
And so, yeah. So from your chair, how if data isn't the answer, because in my mind, data is always the answer. But like, if data is not the answer, what do they need to see or hear? And let's leave out the people who are just like never going to change their opinion and have just decided. But like, there's always some element of people, right, that are able to shift over some period of time. Yeah. What do you think?
So I'm going to meet you halfway on this.
Okay.
And I'm going to say it's not quantitative data. It's qualitative data.
Stories.
It's still narrative, right?
Anecdotes.
Right. Anecdotes kind of grown, right? And what I mean by that is, if the last person who talked to me about the Transportation Climate Initiative and talked about gas taxes, and like I say, most people really have no idea how much they're paying in taxes for gas. So, it feels like a moot point, but it represents something in their mind. And what it represents is a very regular expenditure that feels like a stretch. And what that means is a sense of economic instability, or a sense of uncertainty about how much is this going to cost us. So then we can, if I hear that, if their narrative is, I'm worried about the costs associated with traveling, then I can say, you know what, the Transportation Climate Initiative is going to cost this, and here's where the dollars are going to come from, and here's what it's going to save us. If we can have those conversations, it's really about engagement. We can find so much more common ground if we understand what their worries are about. And so if it means that, as a small business, constituents probably think I'm crazy but I usually use the pizza shop, right? So if the pizza shop is worried that their drivers are going to have to pay more for gas, and they're going to use their platform as a small business owner, and they're going to go to the Chamber of Commerce, and they're going to say, please lobby those legislators to oppose TCI because it's going to cost me more, right? So if I haven't solved why that's a problem for them, then I need to think about how to communicate that better. A lot of our solutions are really good and they're based in data, but we haven't made the case to our constituents. We haven't heard their worries. Sometimes what we're working on will solve their worries and they just don't know. But sometimes we need a little more information to say, you know what, as we do this, we should also add this fund or this piece or this communication that needs to go to small businesses so they know that they're not going to be hit by this, or if they're going to be hit by this, there's going to be relief somewhere down the road. But we're not connecting. We're standing at our opposite sides of the boxing ring and just yelling at each other, right? And that's no way, you can't win anything that way. And nobody makes progress. So we're all in it together. So if we can show how, or get businesses to buddy up, one business that totally believes in it, can they be the conduit for messaging to the business that doesn't support it or the business owner? And so we can start to translate, because maybe as a legislator, I'm not good at talking to the entrepreneur, right? So are there ways we can build our community, share our values, share what our future vision is of clean energy, resilient communities, stable businesses, good paying jobs, all of that. We're not communicating effectively because we're all so busily entrenched in getting our own job done.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I really, really appreciate the conversation. This has been incredible and a very different perspective than, talking to like all of us grinding it out here in industry. And I think it's such an important connection to come back to the sense of community and how we all work together. So thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks for this conversation. It's been fun.
Do you have any final thoughts to share before we jump off?
So I want to go back to the engage idea. So I encourage people to engage with the data. Even if you think you don't understand energy data, engage with it. Talk to people who are not in energy. If you're an energy geek, talk to people who are not in energy and ask them what they need to understand it better, because we all use it. Engage with municipal leaders, because that is your local way to understand how are your schools powered. Is there an opportunity to support, wind energy on municipal land? What are the options locally? And then don't be shy about getting in touch with your legislators. They need experts and they need to hear from constituents. I had a colleague who said one time when there was a piece of legislation I was really passionate about, and my colleague turned to me and said, have any of your constituents reached out to you about this? Mine haven't. And it was something that my constituents absolutely had reached out about. And I thought, oh my gosh, she has not heard from anybody. So don't make assumptions that your legislators have heard from other people. They really need to hear from you.
Yes, that's an awesome call to action. Thank you for that. And if someone would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so I am on Twitter and Facebook. On Twitter is easiest, at Liana Cassar. And I am also on Facebook and I'm on Instagram. So feel free to message me those ways.
Amazing. Well, thank you once again for being with us today. And thank you, listeners, for being here. We value your time and we are glad to welcome you into this conversation. We'll see you next time here on the Power Flow podcast here at the Whiteboard.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Power Flow podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please share the episode with other innovators, leave us a positive review, and subscribe to Power Flow on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find show notes for this episode, more great conversations, Power Flow merchandise, and more at powerflowpodcast.com. Power Flow is hosted by Amy Simpkins, produced by Devin Shonchuk, and managed by Laura Novak. See you next time here at the Whiteboard.